Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. I am here today on a special episode. We're going to be talking about church hurt. I know for some of you listeners, whether you are lay people or even pastors or church leaders, I know this episode's probably going to hit close to home for some of you. But today, joining me, I actually have Micah current with me. He has been on so many of the Stedman podcast episodes. I have now officially made him my co-host. So today's the day, Micah. How do you feel about that?
I feel honored and privileged.
Thank
but
you.
I think you're forgetting somebody.
I am. And we have one other guest. We also have Jordan Halstead with us. Jordan Halstead is a youth pastor out in Oklahoma. And he is also the lead podcaster and creator of Nerd Talk with Jordan Halstead, which is a podcast that both Micah and I frequent on. So if you are interested in hearing about all things nerd, video games, Marvel, DC, comics, everything that you can think of nerddom and fandom, Jordan's your guy. He is the host. And Jordan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I've actually listened to quite a few of your episodes, and I was like, I'm waiting for the day that I'll finally have like that one topic, and you guys were like, hey, here's the one. I was like, oh, I'll be good with this one. I'm excited for this one.
All right.
Not that
cool.
Like the topic is like exciting, but it's one of those like I felt like I can pour into.
And that was the thing I was trying to even remember. It's like, I think this is your first time on my podcast.
Yeah,
so.
This is.
All right. Awesome. So, yeah, so now that we have introductions out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and send everything over to Micah to kind of help lead this episode. He's the one who wrote the questions, and I just got done doing the state youth convention, so I'm still dragging from just a week of final preparations, and then the great weekend we had there. But I'm exhausted, so I'm going to kind of take a step back and let Micah take the lead. So Micah, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, for your listeners, if you're snoring, it's Scott snoring in the background because he spent the weekend with teenagers.
They won't hear it. I'll cut it out and post edit.
Great. So welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast, and also for your listeners, Scott dropped this bomb about 5 minutes ago, letting me know that I was gonna ask the questions. But yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I really felt called to write these questions. We're calling this episode "The Heartbreak of Ministry." Basically, like, what do transitions look like in ministry, whether it's positive, whether it's negative, whether it's good, bad, you name it. Ministry is just a hard thing to do career-wise. And so I felt really compelled to write some questions up in reference to transitions in ministry and titled this podcast, The Heartache of Ministry. And the cool thing about the two guys that are with me today is that the three of us over the last couple of years have had some transitions in ministry, and some of them have been great. Some of them have been not great. But also there have been some very fruitful seasons. And I wanted to just spend the next hour to 90 minutes just kind of like diving into what a transition in ministry looks like, and what two better guys to kind of walk through this journey with me. So I don't know, like, we could start anywhere. I made a list of questions, but maybe give a little bit of background of each of your transitions, and just for clarity, we don't name churches or staff people that we've worked with, but like, just talk a little bit about your transitions, the season that you went through and the season that you're currently in, and how God has kind of, provided and blessed you through the season, even if it's good or bad. We know that he works, for the betterment of our experience and our calling. So, Scott, we'll start with you. What do you think? Talk a little about your transition and the season that you're in right now.
If I look back in my whole ministry career, it has been a lot of transitions. I mean, I transitioned from primarily doing camp ministry to doing a counseling ministry to doing interim work to being a lead pastor at some churches to, now I'm kind of, even doing a podcast ministry now, which I've been doing.
You're in the middle of a transition.
And I'm in the middle of the transition right now. So, I'm applying to churches. I'm interviewing for churches. I'm also kind of helping out churches in the area by doing some consultation work. And then I also work at a bakery, and in some ways I'm kind of even still doing ministry there by, blessing people. And I work at a Christian company, and everybody who works there at least is very strong in their faith, and they go to church, and it's very fascinating just to see the culture, just almost like a kingdom culture in a regular place of business. So that's kind of been, so I say all that because even through those transitions, I would say every single transition has been difficult. Um, leaving the camp ministry, and again, that was my choice to leave because I felt God called me somewhere else. And but then since that was such a big part of my ministry, it was hard to say, hey, I'm no longer going to be doing this anymore. And it's not like, but then there's other play. And I mean, it was like kind of like a good, bad thing because it was a transition, and it was me moving to kind of where I feel like God had called me to do more pastoral ministry. So all that was good, but it was still hard when you make such a big impact in people's lives for almost a decade in camp ministry, whether it's just seasonal or annual. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, I think. And then there's other places where, the transition, it was brutal. It was like falling out of a boat in whitewater rapids and just banging up against the rocks and the waves as you're kind of going down river and hoping you don't get like sucked under the current. So yeah, so that's kind of been my experience with transitions in ministry.
Yeah. I think for me, so, not really, sharing my entire story, but like just, I grew up in a pastor's home, and then Jordan, you grew up in a pastor's home. Just really not feeling the church in my young adult life. Like, I wasn't mad at God. I wasn't mad at my parents. I was mad at kind of how the church as a whole acted. And specifically in transitions into like what my dad was going through. And then I felt like a strong call to join and do worship ministry. And for the last 10 years, I've served as a worship pastor, creative arts pastor, social media pastor, video producer, editor, all those things, like in larger churches and smaller churches alike. Specifically, more recently, it was crazy. And I feel like this episode, we're going to get pretty vulnerable and really, I've been wanting to do this episode, but I've also been dreading it, right? Because I knew how open we were going to be about some of the things that we've been through over the last couple of years. But like, I lost my full-time job in 2020. I was bivocational. I was working super part-time at the church that I was working at as the worship and media pastor, production guy, and walked away from a ministry that I loved, found out that it was not super healthy because I was kind of blind to that because I had blinders on. And then I was offered a full-time ministry position at a large church that had 6 services every weekend. It was a multi-site campus. It was my dream job, right? It was in essence my dream job. And 7 months into my position there, I was released. And I felt released by the Holy Spirit, but I also was just not a good fit for that position. And the staff knew that, and I knew that, and had to part ways. And for the first time in my life, I didn't really have a job. And so it was kind of a scary moment. But in that same moment, I felt God kind of pivoting my call to transition into consulting and coaching and doing some interim work, similar to Scott, what you were talking about a little bit ago. But like, just it became one of the most fruitful seasons of my life, where I served as an interim worship pastor at a Baptist church in our community. And it was 6 months of just, I went in, I led the team with a devotional, I served them communion and stuff during Easter. I led services every week, and I was in and I was out. Like, I didn't have the quote unquote red tape in ministry where you're, accountable to a board, or you were part of the staff. I was literally the interim worship pastor, and I walked in, did my job, and I walked out, and I got paid to do it, which was very, very cool because it was needed in my life at that moment. So yeah. And then, ultimately I got hired back on at Miami University, where I was working before, where I got let go in 2020. And since then we've been filling in and serving at various locations, still coaching and consulting. But yeah, it's been one of the most fruitful seasons. Out of that heartache has been very rewarding. Like, it's one of those, I didn't have a full-time job, and I didn't have a paycheck, like a guaranteed paycheck every week, but I knew that God was going to provide. And one of my favorite scriptures during that time was in First Kings, when Elijah goes to the widow, and the widow was like, I'm going to die because Israel's going through a famine. And there was literally this moment where she was questioning God. She was questioning Elijah, but Elijah's like, make me a meal and God will provide your every need. And at the end of that passage, it says they never ran out. Right. Mm-hmm. So I was just blown away in that season. So yeah, a lot of transitions in the last couple of years. And I want to add to that before we get to Jordan. Like, I think it's incredible. We're all three very, at very different stages of life as far as age, and we're all three married. Some of us have kids, some of us had, don't have kids, different things like that. But like, I think it's interesting, generationally speaking, like our parents have been Scott, is your dad a pastor too?
No, my grandfather was a pastor, but
okay.
That's a whole other story for
another time. So no. So what I'm getting at is that I think it's incredible that like our parents, or grandparents for that matter, stay in ministry assignments a lot longer than we do, or have, at least to this point, right? Like Jordan just made a transition. Scott, you were at your church in Virginia, what, 6 years?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. The longest tenure I have had at a church in 10 years has been 4 years. Every other one has been a year, 2 years max. But, so yeah, I just think it's incredible the difference in our parents' ability to stay places long-term versus ours. And my hope and prayer is that we can find somewhere where we can connect and plug in and get somewhere to be somewhere long-term. But yeah, it's incredible. So Jordan, tell us a little bit about like your transition and ministry experience over the past couple of years, and just, yeah, like the heartache of that, the transitions, the hurt, etc.
So yeah, part of my story is I went to Ohio Christian University. I was a part-time minister in the area. I got a job, I think it was my junior year. I was serving at this small little church, no more than 30 people, and they were paying me part-time. I was getting my feet wet, learning. And I had a conversation with that senior pastor, and I said, hey, is this something that is even potentially a full-time job? I know that there's not a lot of people, and I'm graduating. I just wanted to kind of know. I'd been here a year and a half at that point, and I was like, I just had to have that hard conversation with him. And he said, I don't want to tell you that it's a possibility when it's not, but I would love to keep you, but I know that that's not really an option either. I think you're going to do great. I love your personality. I love where you're at, and I still talk with him every now and then. I'll check up on him, see how he's doing. And so we that was a little bit easier of a transition when we left that small church, and then we moved closer to Katie's hometown, and my wife and so we moved in that area and served at a church for almost 3.5, 4 years. And the end of that scenario was we were forced to sign an agreement that we don't even know why we were asked to leave. It's been a little over a year, and we still don't know all the pieces. Some of the things that were said were, you guys just weren't the right fit. And I said, that's fine. That's where God wants us to not be. That's fine if you don't think that's where we need to be. And then we've also heard that, well, it was because you said this word, or you said this, or you did this. And they were all jokes. Like one of the things, I had a sex talk with our students, and we separated boys and girls. And a year after we left, one of the board members stepped down, and they said, yeah, the thing that they said was, you said boner. And I was like, in that same conversation, I said the word pornography. Like, if boner is your issue, then that's not the issue. There's a heart issue. And so like, we kind of laugh at it now, but it was really, really hard for us because that was our first church. We'd been there 3.5 years, and we fell in love with that church. That was where we were raising our son. That was where we'd grown a youth program from when we started at the beginning with 3 kids to there were 23 kids actively involved. And that was our home. And so when we were asked to leave and had to sign this agreement that basically said, Jordan, you have to be at the church from 9 to 4. You have to ask every time we spend a penny. You have to ask every time that you want to blow your nose or use the bathroom. Like they almost slapped an actual time clock on me. Yeah. Because they were like, you have to be there. And I was like, I'm spending more time outside of the building with these kids. Like, my mentality with the church is, it's not about a 9 to 5 or a 9 to 4 in that case. It was when I can be a part of these kids' lives, like outside of the building, trying to love on these kids. And that was just a leadership difference. And I mean, each leader kind of sees it differently, but when we left, it was really, really hard. And we are actually related to the senior pastor. He married to the same family, or into the same family that I did. And so I'd known this guy for almost 10 years now. And when we left, even he kind of abandoned us. And so that I think made it even harder, was because some of the conversations that preceded everything, and then it just nothing felt right about when we left. And having time to kind of heal through some things and kind of work through some things, and transitioning to Oklahoma, like that was kind of hard, because for the longest time I was like, I'm going to be in Ohio my whole life. Like that's where I want to be. I love Ohio. I love the ministry, and ministry in Ohio is a lot of fun,
but it's vastly different.
It's vastly different. My dad was in Ohio ministry and built this name and built like this credibility, and some people liked him, some people didn't, and that's just kind of the way the cookie crumbles with some of that some days. And with the ways that people saw me, they were like, oh, you're Jeremy's kid, or oh, you're Jeremy's kid. And so I had to build my own name through that. And when we came out here, it was no longer, oh, you're Jeremy's kid. It's, oh, we knew your dad, but we're excited to see what you're going to do. And I got ordained out here, and there's been a lot of really good stuff that's happened out here. And so the transition's been fun. But I'm having to unlearn a lot of things from what I had learned in Ohio. And I mean, it's been hard, but it's been worth it. And that's one of those really cool things, is just to see like where we're seeing some truth kind of starting to take place. And we're like, oh, that's not how we understood it, but that's okay. Like, we're excited. We're here. We're happy. We're loving where we're at. So.
Yeah. And I don't know, Scott, that could almost be a separate podcast, being a pastor's kid.
Yeah.
Right. Because like Jordan and I are pastors' sons, and both of our dads are pastors within the Church of God. And we're, I'm vastly different. I think that's the word of the day. Monday's word of the day, vastly. Vastly different. From my dad, I'm vastly different, as far as theology and the way I perceive worship. But all that to say, we're all ordained in the Church of God Anderson, and we're ordained pastors, and those transitions are never easy. And Scott, you and I talked a little bit a couple of weeks ago about calling versus career in one of the episodes that we did. And I was on a staff at a rather large church last year, and it wasn't, the term pastor wasn't used very much, right? It was, they were the director of worship, or the director of children, or the director of youth ministry, or the director of student ministry, or et cetera, et cetera. And if you look up, like, let's just say Crossroads Church in Cincinnati, which is one of the largest churches in the country, if you look at their website, and I pulled it up right now, and their job postings, right? They have facilities team member, connections director, broadcast video technical director, part-time front of house engineer, part-time stage lighting director. All those to say, like, there's not one job on that job site that says pastor. And so calling versus career, you can make a career out of ministry and not be a pastor or a pastorate. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So do you guys believe that it has to be pastor? Do you guys believe that it has to be that? Like, is a calling necessarily a pastor position? And then, like, one of the other questions that I wrote down, like, if it is a calling, does it change, right? Like, you could be, I don't know, Scott, you could be the creative arts pastor at a church, and then all of a sudden you feel God's calling you to be a lead pastor. Or Jordan, you're a youth pastor and you feel called to be a young adults pastor, or feel, in the directions of, like a family life pastor, multiple generations being, leading multiple generations in a church versus just specifically student ministry. Have you guys had that happen in your life? Do you believe that you can do both? Could it be a calling? Could it be a career? Could it be just one or the other? And what does that look like as far as shaping what you guys do in ministry? Like, Scott, what do you think of that? Like, for example, I thought for sure, like, worship was going to be my thing forever. Right. And like, I've done young adult ministry, I've done youth ministry, I've done worship ministry, and then like recently in the last couple of years, because of COVID and different things, I really have dove headfirst into the production side of things with podcasting and video editing and producing. Like it's changed vastly, and even coaching. Like I'm in the next couple of months, I'm going to be joining in with Jeanette Flynn and Leadership Focus of the Church of God, just coaching people, young pastors who are going through the ordination process. And I never dreamed that I would be doing that, but it's something different. So what are you guys' thoughts?
Yeah, so I would say when it comes to calling versus career, I think there's almost a disconnect sometimes.
Yeah.
I think for people who are going into the ministry or people who are working in churches, like as a Sunday school teacher, I think that there is a sense of calling to do that stuff, because it's not just, if the calling of a pastor is just to go in and to preach Sunday morning and then that's all you do, I mean, that's a pretty great gig. That's like basically what Billy Graham does, right? Or what he used to do, like travel around, speak. And that was basically was his thing. Evangelism. Yeah, just go around speaking. Where when I think of a pastor, I think of someone who not only reads the scriptures, studies them, and tries to communicate that to the church that he's serving, but then there's also pastoral care. There's meeting not only the needs of the congregation of church, but how do you meet the community needs? Is there needs within the community in which your church is located at that you and your people that you're serving can go out and help do? So I think there's that as a calling. However, I think that in the same, and I'm going to speak specifically within church culture, I think that there's also times where there's people within the church that are like lay people, congregants, maybe even some lay leaders who look at church as, and the pastor more as a CEO. Looks at someone who is kind of this person that we hire in to help lead our company, and based on metrics and performance and all these things, and do a performance review, that they are going to either pass the test and we'll keep them on for another year or two, or we're going to say, hey, there's some issues and you need to change. And I think sometimes where the disconnect comes from is basically, a pastor may go into a church thinking this is a calling. I feel called by God to be here, to serve these people, to love these people, and to do what God calls us to do within this season as this figure, as this leader in the church. And then I think there's other people on the other side of the camp who say, this is our figurehead. Yeah. This is the person that is going to be the face of basically our church ministry, or our business or our ministry. And if the community in the congregation is not responding to this figurehead as we would like, then there's going to be some problems. And I think when that happens, I think how the church responds to it, or how leaders respond, either they're very blunt and saying, hey, we feel like it's just not working out. We think you're great, but we're going to have to ask you to leave, and kind of, try to do it very respectfully, even though that's a hard conversation to have. Or they do where they make decisions and make decisions that make it very difficult. It's almost like they're kind of forcing you out, but not really, because they're just trying to make things hard. So that way they don't have to have the blowback of saying, oh, well, you didn't force them out. They actually said they're going to resign. But it's like, well, you kind of,
but they're putting all that pressure on you to do so.
You're putting pressure and you're putting things in place that's making it really hard for a leader to stay there. So it's almost like they're quietly forcing you out. And I can remember, and just to share a quick story, I remember one of the churches I pastored at, there was a family that left, and I got like a very nasty email from someone. And basically they simply said, well, you don't see this as a calling, you see this as a job. And it's like, and kind of like my thought process is like, well, if I saw this as a job, then this would be probably the worst job I ever wanted to do, because ministry is hard. I don't
Yep.
think anybody would say, man, I really want to go to a church where I can communicate and show God's love to people who either A, are going to respond to it, and some people are going to absolutely hate it and make my life miserable. Like, or make things in the church miserable. Like, no one says, man, that's a great career choice. Because I mean, if this was a job, I mean, I'd be like, nope, I'm done after 8 months. Because it's like, yeah, I don't like the culture here. It's very toxic. I'm going to go somewhere else. You know, I mean, I don't see the church as a McDonald's. You know, if I see the church as a loving community. So,
well, and to be fair, like too, you know, just like any interview process, whether it's a church job or secular job, like it could look great on the outside, but once you get on the inside and realize how toxic it is, it may not be wise or healthy for you to stay long term anyway.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, Scott, could you speak a little bit more into that, like where you were talking about people giving you evaluations and things like that? Because didn't that happen to you recently?
Yeah. So I mean, and there's a couple out of all the ministries I've been a part of, I don't think I've ever had any type of performance reviews. I mean, if anything, like if I was like, even like in camp ministry, like if there was something that I was doing wrong or slacking, usually the director would just pull me aside and would just say, hey, I'm seeing something, I'm noticing something. And I'm like, oh, well, thank you. And it's like, it was almost like, okay, well, thank you for bringing it to my attention. I will adjust and correct. So it was almost like there's a rebuke, I correct, and then we're good. Even in other churches, and I might have shared this story before, where, when I was bivocational, I preached a bad sermon and had an elder kind of talk to me in private and right then and there, and it was fine. And then recently I was at a church where we didn't have a performance review, and then like it was like all of a sudden, like I think probably 2 or 3 years into the ministry here, they decided to do a performance review. And it was very strange because it was almost like I could go through the whole entire year doing ministry thinking things are great, and then I sit down and there's this performance review and I look at it, and sometimes I'd be like, I'd have to ask questions because I'm very confused. And I'm like, well, what's this? And I don't understand why I got this score on this. Can you please explain it to me? And then they couldn't explain it to me because it's like, oh yeah, well, there was something that happened back in like March. And then my response was, well, wouldn't it be easier for me to have that brought to my attention back in March and not in January of next year? Because how can I fix something or notice a blind spot that I have if it's being brought, and then even then you guys don't even very remember all the details because it's been 7 or 8 months. So I'm kind of against performance reviews because A, I think it's more business culture than kingdom culture, and B, it's almost to the point where at the end of the day, it's always just judgment and looking down as far as, well, here's our assessment of you through the whole year, where if there were some blind spots, where I think in a kingdom culture, it's more of if you see something in a brother or sister, that's when you go to them in private. That's like, hey, I just want to let you know I'm seeing this, or I think you're starting to, I think your attitude is becoming more rigid than loving. Is there, and not only like a judgment, but hey, what's going on? You don't seem like yourself. Let's talk about that. And I think when you approach it that way, that's what really causes healthy growth, not only within a church culture, but healthy church growth within your leaders and your elders and your staff.
Well, those are all great points. And I think like too, that it's almost like people are looking for that stuff, right? They're, yes, there are times and seasons in our lives where we go through things that are hard, and it could be financial things, it could be losing a parent or losing a friend. As pastors, we lose people in congregations due to health issues all the time, right? And so like you could be going through a season of life where you're not super happy and things are going, but we're human, right? And so there could be times where things are legitimately wrong. And Scott, that's a great point. Like why do people wait until it essentially boils over to have that conversation versus, hey, pull them aside, just make sure you're doing okay. Just wanted to check in. I know for me, like one of my pastorates early on, I was serving as an associate pastor. I did worship and I did young adults, and was full time there. And the lead pastor, had left to go to another church. I was there a year and a half, and a year and a half into my ministry, the pastor had left. And unfortunately, shortly after that, the chairman of the board came into my office, like on Good Friday of all days, right? Wasn't so good for me, but he had basically a new contract and told me to sign it, and he wouldn't leave my office till I signed it, stating that if I was going to do A, B, C, D, and if I didn't do A, B, C, D in 60 days, that they were going to, go another direction. So at the time, I was freshly engaged to my wife, who I'm married to now, and we're trying to figure out this life and moving, and her coming here, and all these things, right? All these moving parts. And I was essentially like pressed against the wall and basically going to lose my job if I didn't do what they said or exactly how they said it. And I felt like I was walking on eggshells, and the church was already going through a transition because the lead pastor had left. So it's one of those things where, Scott, you talked about either just bowing out gracefully and just leaving so it doesn't have to get ugly, which is what I ultimately did, because I just felt like God was releasing me from that, because he didn't want me to go through what was yet to come. Because even if I would have stayed, I would have still had to go through the transition of ministry where they were in the process of hiring a new lead pastor. So it was just, those aren't ever easy either. So all that to say, I think it's all about how you hold yourself and how the church holds itself. And in a little bit, we'll talk a little bit about like staying longer than you should in a ministry position. But Jordan, like, speak into that a little bit, like talk to us about, like, those kind of things that we've been talking about with Scott.
Well, you'd asked the whole, is ministry a calling or a career? And as I was kind of working through this one, I think it's both.
Yeah.
I think that ministry it can be a career.
You can make it a career.
Yeah. Well, you had said, like, people come in for the money, and I just kind of laughed, because I was like, that's not the position that like makes money. Like, churches it's not about money. Like, we're if you're truly in it for the right reasons, you're not in this for the money, because there's not a lot of money always here.
Yeah.
Some churches are a little bit more blessed than others, and I'm in a situation where I'm very blessed right now. But not every church is blessed. Not every church can afford. Sometimes you're bivocational. Sometimes that's like, it's just not always about money. That's not what, like you guys have been saying, kingdom focused, not earthly focused here. And so I think that for calling, like, I felt called at a very young age. Scott, you and I, we went to the same camp growing up, and Micah, you even were at this camp. But when Scott was on staff, I was growing up, and I remember watching Scott, looking up to you and Ty and John and all these guys that even Ryan Garnes, and who's been on former podcasts and stuff. Like, I remember doing ministry because I loved it, and then starting to see I'm called to it. It wasn't just because this is something I love doing. This isn't just because I can get $100 a week being a part-time youth pastor at a church. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that God called me. And I think that callings move. Like, clearly I'm no longer in Ohio. I'm in Oklahoma, and I felt that calling, that when we left Ohio and our church in Ohio, that was really hard, because like we were kind of forced out. But it also came down to my decision. Do I stay and fight? Do I try and stay through this? Do I try and find a job and keep this? I mean, there were a lot of pieces to it, but I felt that the right move was to resign, and that was the right call. And because it was either that or termination. I would rather take resignation. And I that was really hard. But ministry, I think, ministry is this calling. We're called, and maybe there's a season where you're transitioning, and you need a little bit of space, and you need to figure out some things to heal, and some things to how can I learn from this. My senior pastor Steve out here, he's an amazing guy, and I remember some of the first conversations we had was, you got to look back and figure out what you can learn from the situation and how to move forward, because you're called to something. And if you're called to it, just learn and keep moving forward. That's all you can really do. Like, you can't fix the past. You can't go back and redo. Life is life. You just keep moving forward. And he really instilled that in me. And I think that a calling is just that moving forward of, whether I'm youth pastor for a time, if I'm senior pastor for a time, if I'm to be at a church, or to do consulting work, or counseling, or maybe I go to one of our local colleges and I go and teach. There's a lot of my friends who have been in ministry, and I've seen them change, and they're not running a church anymore. They're not even running a ministry in the same context of being like in a church. They're now doing camp ministry. Like I remember when John Trussell went from like being a school teacher full time, and then during the summer he would be at camp, to going and being a camp director full time. And that was a huge jump for them. And it was really cool to see some of that. And so I think the calling kind of changes. There's seasons to the calling. I don't think the calling ever like goes away though. I think that it changes like directions and locations and things like that, but it doesn't go away. But the career side to it, I think that there's two aspects that I want to hit on this. I think that the career is, some people are just like, I'm in it because this is like something that I know I can do for the church. Like where you're saying like, it's not a pastor position, but it's like the technology director, or a kids ministry director, or things like that. There's people who I can do that. I know I can fill this need. I'm capable. I can do this. This is a career move, not a I'm called to it. And I think that sometimes it's good, sometimes it's extremely dangerous, because they rely on themselves more than they rely on God. I think that when you start to look at it like it's a career, you say, hey, I can do it. I don't know that I'm called to this, but I know that like I remember being called to something. I remember being called straight to youth ministry in between 8th and 9th grade. 2008, it was between 7th and 8th grade. It was 2008 when I was called at summer camp. And I remember that. I remember God just laying it on my heart. And that next year, I just talked with God, and I was like, God, where am I going with this? And I remember having those conversations. And but for people who get to that career point, like, I don't mind. There's people who do things really well. Like there are some people who can do technology really, really well. And maybe it's not that they're the communications pastor, but maybe they are just the communications director. And they're just the guy who just runs in and just does tech. And some people see that as a ministry, and some people are like, it's just a job. I can do this. Like I'm gifted with technology. I know my tech. I can do it. And I think the other side to that though is when the calling feels like a career. And you guys have probably felt this before. I remember when we left Ohio that last month, I didn't feel like it was ministry. That last month, I felt like I walked in almost every day about to be fired, because there was hostility, and there was a lot of hurt feelings, and I struggled with that. I think that I felt like it was just a job I was going to, and I hated that. And I said, God, I don't understand. And sometimes that makes it all the worse, is when you feel like your calling has become a career and it drains you.
Well, so. And to be fair, right? Like if and just to piggyback off of what you said, Jordan, like I've been in situations that are super toxic and unhealthy, and I needed to walk away, and I resigned, and I knew that the transition was coming. But one of the most gratifying things, even at the lowest of lows for me, is that when I know that I did the right thing and I left on the best terms possible, that last Sunday that you're there, you say your goodbyes, you hand the keys, your key fob, your credit card, whatever it is, to transition out. Like it's the most freeing and liberating thing. And you've done the right thing. Well, would you guys agree with that? Scott, anybody? Like, for me, like the last couple of ministry assignments that I've been in, and I've known that God was in it, and God was going to provide and bless and take care of us through those transitions, even the lowest of lows, the valleys that we were walking through, the heartache, the relationships that we built. Like we knew that God was still going to provide. We knew that God was still going to show up. We knew that God was still going to bless us with friends and opportunities. But like there was a church, that I was working at, and I knew that I needed to go. And I literally handed my keys. They prayed for me, and I walked out the door, and I felt the weight of the world lifted off of my shoulders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it was a good thing. And it was solidifying the fact that God was saying, you're released, you need to go.
Yeah.
Well,
absolutely. Mm-hmm.
You mind if I play off that real quick?
Go
Absolutely.
ahead.
So like for me, when I left this church, the morning of, I'm going to go to because it was a Wednesday that we left, and we weren't even allowed to say goodbye to the students. It was a pretty hostile situation. So kind of like that whole where you're like, that last Sunday, and just kind of that freeingness. Like we didn't get all of those pieces, but what was weird for me looking back on it, I'm like, I swear that it was just kind of God just kind of letting me let some of this go. It's kind of embarrassing, but I don't mind sharing this. The night before, I was so filled with stress, and like we went to Bible study, and it's not related to the church, and some friends, and my kid, he was a little over one, like 1 and 2 months, something like that, so like 14 months, and he wouldn't leave my side. And so that night I go to bed and I'm like, I'm stressed out of my mind. And I woke up the next morning and I had actually wet the bed. Like I was so stressed, my body could not contain it anymore. Like I literally could not hold anything back. I couldn't, like, I felt like I was going to vomit. I felt like very sick to my stomach, and I just couldn't hold anything in anymore. And with that, like having woken up, soiled myself, I was like, are you kidding me? Like, God, like I can't handle this anymore. Like I'm gonna have to resign soon. And I went to the church and I was on the phone with my mom, and it was like 9:05, 9:08, something like that. I was supposed to be in the door at 9, but I was on the premises and nobody calls at 9. And I was sitting in my car and I'm like, Mom, this is what happened. Like, I just don't think I can do this anymore. And I see these 4 cars parade into the parking lot. And like I saw them coming down the road, and I was like, hey Mom, I'm gonna have to let you go. I think I'm gonna get fired. And the conversation was really, really rough. And as soon as like they asked for the keys and I gave them away, like I felt the weight of the world. It was gone. And I was like just playing into that. It was that whole, there was no more stress. I was calling some of the families that were at the church. Specifically Gabe and Julie. I called them. I said, hey guys, I want you guys to know, like, I was asked to leave. I've resigned. Things are, it is what it is, but don't be strangers. Just know that I love you. I still care for you guys and your family. And I called a few people and just let them know real quick, hey, we're not there anymore. You're going to hear Sunday, but we kept it pretty hushed. We didn't make it some big, we didn't want to fight them. It was not worth that fight for us, but I remember just having that, like you said, that weight, it lifted. I wish we would have got to say goodbye to some of the students in person. Because that was really hard when I asked them. I said, are you guys going to tell them? Should I come in tonight and tell them? Like, and they basically were like, no, we'll tell them. Like, you're going to get all your stuff out right now. We actually have boxes with us to help you move out. And I said, well, I will call my grandma and I'll call Katie, and grandma just lives down the road. She'll get the truck. She'll get the big furniture that is mine from the office. And one guy tried to help me, and I said, you've done enough, and like, you don't need to touch my stuff. You can sit there and watch, but there's not a lot of wiggle room, so I'm going to need you out of my way, so that way I can get. And as soon as I turned in the key, I was like, weight of the world's gone. Now the stress of trying to figure out when you're the only income, trying to figure that part out was a different story. But yeah, that weight was gone.
Jordan, when was that? 21?
Yeah, February 21.
Yeah, so mine was a little bit experience was a little bit different, but like I was working, like I said, bivocational in 2020. I was working full-time at Miami. I lost my job. I was working part-time at the church, like, and by part-time I mean super part-time, like a couple $100 every couple of weeks, right? Like very, very, very part-time. So like I had lost my job. COVID happened. And when I lost my job at my secular job at Miami, they were like, you're welcome to apply for jobs. You're welcome to continue working here until your contract's up in June. And COVID happened, right? And nobody in their wildest dreams would have imagined what was going to happen during COVID, right? And so one of the things at Miami, when I was working there and I was working through my contract, the plan was for me just to continue working, find another job while I was working so that I could just transition after my contract was up. Now, when they sent us home in March of 2020, there was a hiring freeze. Miami stopped hiring people. Like, it was just like, I was stuck, literally stuck. And so the plan, Alicia and I prayed about it, and we were just like, the thing is, we're going to work through this contract. You're going to continue to get paid full-time until June. God's going to provide. Everything's going to be okay. Now, the church side of that was that I had worked through I continued to work at this church, and during that time, my contract ran out in the summer of 2020, and another church reached out to me about, they got my resume, they had heard about me, they had heard about like this amazing opportunity came about where I could have a full-time ministry, a full-time job, basically my dream job, right? And like the pastor caught wind of it, and he blew a gasket. He absolutely blew a gasket, because even though I was part-time, I did a lot and had a lot invested in that ministry. And so basically he called an elder meeting and said, look, this guy's talking to another church. He's probably going to leave. What do we do? What are we going to do about it? And I was like, this is crazy. For a part-time position, you're calling an elder meeting, and like you're just freaking out. And I'm like, this is not even necessary. It's not even a done deal. And so like he called an elder meeting, and I walk into the church on Sunday morning, and the first thing out of his mouth to me was, did you get the job? Mind you, I had not had an offer. I didn't have an official offer from this other church. And I just was like, what am I supposed to do now? People know about this other, potential opportunity. And, there's probably going to be a transition, but we don't know, but again, I had never had to put my trust in God more in that moment, because I walked into his office after church and I said, I can't do this anymore. And he's like, so are you resigning? And I was like, yes, I will give you 2 weeks right now. We're done. It's finished. Like Jesus said, it is finished. Like it was just, and for the next 2 weeks, I was able to train other staff members on what I did and walk them through that stuff. But it was one of the most sobering moments, because literally I had no offer. I had no other job. I had no other opportunity. I had been applying for jobs, but in the height of COVID in 2020, I had no idea what I was going to do. And so, yeah, like I said, I gave my keys that last Sunday, and they prayed for me, and I just walked out the door. And since then, that pastor and I have talked. We've had dinner, but like that church was super toxic, and it was unhealthy, because there was just so many different things that I wasn't seeing, like from the outside looking in. And then, I just kind of transitioned into the next ministry role that was available to me. And I went through the motions. I did my job. I did it well, but it was hard because I was micromanaged, and I wasn't like free to do anything. And I just felt right off the bat that not that I made a mistake, because I wouldn't change anything that I did for anything, but like, it was very, very trying for me. Like, but again, all that to say, the point of the matter is that like we knew that God was in it, and God was going to bring us through it. And it was, it was tough. And like, even, taking it back to being a kid, being a pastor's kid, like transitioning from one ministry to another, you're like basically uprooted. Your life is uprooted. It's very much to like a military, right? My wife's dad is in the military, my father-in-law, and they moved a lot. She moved a lot as a kid. And so we have very, very similar, childhoods in the respect that we moved a lot. So, but like all that to say, you're moving and you're uprooting your life, you're uprooting your kids' lives. And thankfully, Jordan, you got a 2-year-old, so he's probably not even going to remember the fact that he moved from Ohio to Oklahoma.
He won't recognize that he's a Buckeye. He'll be like, I'm an Oklahomie.
Yes. So, all that to say, like, transitions are hard, and let's take it a step further. Like, unless Scott, did you have anything to say about that or add to that?
No, not at all. You guys are good.
Yeah. Well, Scott finished a youth convention yesterday, so he's probably taking a snooze in his chair. Let's talk a little bit about transitions in ministry and leaving on good terms. Like Jordan and I, you and I talked just briefly about, not leaving on so good terms, but like, leaving on good terms versus leaving in bad terms, like the relationships that you build with people, the relationships that you foster with people that like basically become your surrogate family, because your family may be in another area. Like my dad's in Pennsylvania, Jordan, your dad's in Kentucky, like their pastors elsewhere, and like, so this is our family's, quote unquote, family. Like, speak into that a little bit. The one thing that I've learned is that your friends will be your friends regardless of whether you're serving in that ministry or not. And I'm here to say that every church I've pastored, I still talk to some people from each of those ministry opportunities, and it's been great. Like, we're still friends. Like, the church building, the church that's the church that you've worked at does not define the calling and the friendships and the relationships that you build in those places. The broken ones are a different story, but the true people that are your true friends will still be your friends. So, Scott, talk about, like, relationships and transitions,
Yeah. So transitions. Wow. That's a great topic, because, when I think about it's hard to always gauge transitions. I think that there are some ministries where you can clearly tell the transition from this ministry, from being in this ministry and out of that particular ministry, are either good or either bad. And I think, but then I think there's also some transitions where it's kind of indifferent in some ways. There's some good and there's some bad. And just kind of, just to kind of paint that picture, when I left the camp ministry, good terms. When I left the counseling agency I worked at, good terms. When I was doing interim stuff, and especially the church I was working at as an interim before I left to be the lead pastor of a church in Ohio, I left on good terms with them. Actually, the person that they gave their new pastor, like, I was still there. They said, "Hey, can you speak?" I said, "Yeah." And I was there, and I supported the guy. And actually, that same guy, he's working on his doctorate at the same school I am. So and I told him, like, because he even said, he thought that he wasn't a good pastor because that church ended up closing. And I told him, I said, "Dude, I thought you did a great job. Just from the outside looking in, I think you were doing a lot more for that church than I think any other pastor at that church had done," and just really kind of gave him the encouragement that he needed. When I was in Ohio, left on good terms, went to Virginia. And then when I left Virginia, the church in Virginia, I believe that for some people, I left on good terms. And I think for some people, it wasn't so good. And so it was indifferent. And the way I kind of picture that is, I say that, it really goes back to, how does one view relationships? And I always kept telling my leadership teams, I always tell people relationships are two-way streets. Because if you love people and they love you back, then that's good. And there's been a lot of times where, like, even now, like, I still have contact with people from the church I pastored in Ohio. Even just last year, like, the treasurer of the church reached out to me, just kind of let me know how things are going at the church, thanked me, said, all the changes you made and all the stuff you did for us has really helped us a lot. And I don't think a lot of people really recognized all the hard work you did. And this was, like, right when I was walking out the door of the other church. So it was like, great. The impact I made in this church in Ohio still continues to have a ripple effect of great things that God's doing in that church to this day from my wisdom and leadership. Where when I left here in Virginia, I had a lot of people say, "Oh, we love you. We care for you. We love your kids, and we care about you." And then since I left, there's been at least 2 or 3 families that still reach out to me. "Hey, how are you doing?" There's one lady in particular that when I left was the only lady who wrote birthday cards to my kids and said, "Hey, happy birthday, Peter. Happy birthday, Elizabeth. Happy birthday, Laura." And even Liz, this year, I got a birthday card from her. And I mean, she didn't have to do it, but I made such an impact in her life. And actually, we're going to go get coffee this Wednesday. So it's like, out of all the people who said, "We love you, we still want to keep in touch with you. We still want to be able to do things with you since you're still living in the area." And I said, "That's great. I would love that." And yet, only out of the 50 so families, only 3 people actually still continue to actually want to continue that relationship. So I think that's always the hard part with ministry transition, is you have so many people who say things, but then when it comes to practice, the practice doesn't match what they're saying. And that's why I always say, well, relationships are two-way street. So for me as a pastor, it goes back to, well, did people really care about my ministry? Did they really care about not only about my ministry, but did they really care about me as a human being, as a husband, as a father? When they said they really care about my kids and love my kids, do they really? Because you say you do, but yet you never talk to them. You've never tried to send a card. Even during the pandemic, my kids got cards from churches that me and my wife visited when we go on vacation. Hey, we just want to let you know that we love you. We're thinking about you and we're praying for you during this difficult time. Yeah. And not once from anyone in my church ever sent a card to my kids saying the same exact thing.
Well, I think it's a little bit different too.
Yeah, absolutely. It is different.
Like you're still there, right?
Yeah,
like
I'm
you
still
haven't
here.
moved. Jordan, however,
yeah, exactly.
Like moved from Ohio to Oklahoma. Like I've moved from Ohio to North Carolina back to Ohio. And even growing up as a pastor's kid, I was born in Mississippi and lived in Michigan and Kentucky and Ohio, West Virginia, Indiana. My parents pastored a church in North Dakota, and now my dad's in Pennsylvania, but we've been all over the place. So taking that a step further, when you're in a ministry position and you go through those transitions, sometimes it's a blessing because you can be uprooted and moved, to another location. Yes, you have to build new relationships and break down those barriers and trust people and build new friendships and relationships, but it helps you get out of that environment. If for example, it's a toxic place and community where oh, am I going to bump into so-and-so at the grocery store and what am I supposed to say in that moment? And for me, I'm still, I still live 10 minutes away from one of the last churches I pastored. And so we drive by, we go to Menards and I drive by the building, we go to, Best Buy or wherever. And we're still very much in that community, but I still have very good relationships that I left on such good terms with people that I can still have those conversations, call, text, email, whatever. And even some of the staff members that I've worked with, I still have worked on projects with those people. And I've since been back to that ministry since, the toxic, since, for example, I think I went back because they were having some issues with some of their production gear and they called me and said, would I be willing to come in? And I said, sure, I don't have an issue with that. But I also didn't have I didn't have a dog in the fight. I didn't have anything to lose. Right. At that point, I wasn't on the payroll. I wasn't being judged or Scott, what you were saying earlier to our listeners, but being, questioned on every little move you make, Jordan, to what you were saying, being at the church by 8:59 and clocked in, that was another piece of that church that I told you that I was given a new basically a new contract. They wanted me to keep a timesheet of all my hours and sign off on it every week. And I was like, this is ridiculous. And fast forward, that was in 2012, 2013, something I was there 2 years. So 2012 and 13, fast forward to 2020 when COVID happened, we're all working at home. How are they going to justify doing that now? Right. Jordan, that's kind of an interesting, caveat because, COVID was still kind of roaring like a lion, so to speak, during 21. And you know what I mean? How are you supposed to clock in? What if you got sick? What if you didn't? What if, other people, and that's crazy that they just stormed the gates like that and, brought boxes. Oh my gosh. I think that should be a question that I didn't write down. What's the craziest thing that's happened to you in the heartache of ministry? And Jordan, I think you answered it with your
and even kind of follow up with the relationship aspect, even when I left Ohio and I'm here, it wasn't I was sending Christmas cards to everyone back at the church in Ohio. But I think there'd be times where if I was back and I talked to people, they'd be excited to see me. They talk to me, they do everything else. And it is different when you're still living in the same area or even sometimes I think even in the same state. I know Jordan, your dad talked about when he left the church he was at in Northeast Ohio. And he even was thinking, I'm not going to stay in the same state or do youth stuff in the same state, because when I go to youth events, I'm going to be seeing the kids that I used to pastor at, and that's going to be rough. But then he ended up getting a position down in Southwest Ohio and things were fine, or at least it seemed like things were fine, but I mean, his ministry thrived down there, and he was still able to do great stuff, and still was able to have those relationships. Because I know Ryan, like we mentioned, Ryan Garnes in this episode, and he was one of Jeremy's youth up in Northeast Ohio, and now here he is, kind of casually crossing paths with your dad during summer camps and conventions and stuff, and still building those relationships. So there's some good that can happen with that. And
well,
even
I think
go
real
ahead.
quick, one of the other things is Ryan didn't just leave it at like, oh, you were my youth pastor and that's it. Dad had such a relationship with guys like Ryan that Ryan even came down and visited us just on a weekend, like him and one of the other guys named Jaron. Both of them came down and visited us one weekend, and they were like, hey, can we just come down and visit? And we had those times together. And then when he went on to full-time staff, like him and John would come down. There were probably, I can think of like 4 or 5 different weekends that I remember that Ryan came and stayed at our house. And that was just because like we'd known Ryan and all that. And that was no big deal for us. And it was that relationship. And I think Dad was afraid of it at the beginning, but I think that when he saw like the impact that he made, that he kind of could draw those lines that, hey, we don't see each other very often, but I can still love on you from afar when I do see you.
Yeah. And even just to kind of talk about relationships and even kind of even healing, there is, I mean, they're joking that I might be sleeping because I just got done hosting a youth convention, and, we had it here where I live, and, the church sent their teens here. And so, and I wasn't really nervous about, what's it going to be, or how's it going to look, or who's coming. But, once I was able to get registration forms and get the t-shirts and saw who was coming, I know one of the individuals was someone who, kind of said some not so nice things to me, so I was a bit nervous, but I get there and they show up and do registration. I say hi to the kids. I say hi to both, the leaders that are there, and, having very good conversations. We're laughing, we're joking around. And at the end, we close everything out and they're leaving. And this gentleman comes and just says, hey, thank you so much. This was great. And comes and gives me like a big hug. And I started following up with him because his wife recently passed away. And like after like almost a few months after I left, and I sent him a card and called and left a message saying, hey, and just talked to him how he is. And I mean, and it was like, things were good. And, and I think, kind of, in hindsight, looking back at what was happening and kind of what caused all the, some of the not those nice things, you can really look back and go, okay, it was just more of a cultural thing. It was more of just kind of the times, still being in COVID, still dealing with a lot of more of like issues within the church that are beyond anyone's control. It was beyond my control, elder board's control, all the ministry team's control. It's like there's nothing anyone could do to fix it. It had to be a God thing, for anything to get fixed. And at the end, that's no issue or blame or anger that I can hold on to, because at the other end, I'm able to see everything more clearly. It's like when you're in the forest, it's hard to see what's happening in the forest. Once you're out of the forest and you're able to be above it and kind of look back and look down, you're able to see, oh, here were some of the things here's why this happened. And even more of a self-reflective thing, okay, here are some of the things where I kind of didn't help the situation as well. And really look at that and kind of look objectively and say, okay, yeah, there were some things here, there are some things here. And even just that connection, there's a healing and reconciliation through that hug and through that laughter and through the handshakes and through the casual conversations where there was no ill will and there was no anger or hate or any long-term issues that came from that. And even when I left, I never felt that, but it was more of that thing like, ooh, I don't know, because, I don't feel this way about this person, but they may feel differently about me. And you don't know because you don't have those conversations. There's not that there's not that time of reconciliation. But when you are able to have that, it's like, oh, okay, things are good now. So, that's why I always say relationships are two-way streets. If it's always one-sided, then it's very hard to gauge whether it's a pastor who's been hurt or whether it's a congregant that's been hurt by a pastor or another congregate church leader. There's that thing. So once you're able to have that relationship thing, and that's why I'm always preaching Matthew on how to deal with conflict. It's like, yeah, go to that person privately, because again, just going to that person, it's relational. Having another person come to you, it's relational. And then bring it before the church. And when we see that, it's almost like, okay, now we're going into trial and we see it as a court case. It's like, well, no, I see it as you're now in a believing community. And now we have an entire community surrounding the situation, who's trying to help heal the situation, trying to bring reconciliation to this situation, so that if reconciliation can happen, then with the body of Christ surrounding that and loving that and pouring out godly biblical wisdom to that, then that's where healing comes. And even if they do it right, and that's the way, and the person still doesn't reconcile, then that's when it's like, okay, well, like Paul says, cast them out as if they're an unbeliever. But I think, and this may be another topic, so I don't want to get too far off track, but I think when it comes to dealing with church conflict, we do it so businesslike and so legalistically that it's not how God has designed how to handle conflict in a kingdom culture.
Yeah.
Hey, Scott, you
Yes.
You were talking about just that guy that came and hugged you.
Yeah.
And I it made me think of something. So there's this guy that as I was leaving our Ohio church, he said, the reason we're asking you to leave is you're manipulative, divisive. I mean, he was throwing words that should not have been used. And I laughed because what you saw, that kind of that healing in August. I mean, it was almost 6 months after we left. I got to have a conversation with him. I actually came out here to Oklahoma, brought my car, did an event, and then went home to go pick up Katie and Ollie and bring them out. And so that Sunday I talked with, or Pastor Steve had talked about this whole, you got to let some of these things go. You got to like, it's kind of like having a sack of potatoes. Like if you keep carrying it, one, it's getting heavier and heavier because you're getting weaker by holding that. But the other side is, it starts to get, the potatoes start to get stinky, and then like you're causing people around you to not want to be near you because you're holding on to this. And so I went to that guy and I just said, I forgive you. I don't want there to be any hostility between us. I want you to understand that like, it's okay. Like, I think that you played a part that helped me get to Oklahoma, and I just want to let you know I forgive you. Like there are no strings attached. There's no problem. And the dude broke down in tears. And he said, that's all I was wanting. And I didn't know how to even talk to you about it because I thought you were so mad at me. And I said, I probably would have been had you addressed it right after because of the things that you said. But I want you to know I'm not mad. I think that you played a part in a bigger story, and it's okay. God forgave me, and the least I can do is forgive you. And I even remember my mom and dad having that same kind of issue when they left their Northeast Ohio church. They went in and there was someone who slammed them, and they were downright nasty. And I talked with my mom. Man, this was a few months ago. I was talking, I said, what happened? Like, I thought that they weren't friends with us. And you went and actually saw them when you went up to do a wedding. And she said, what happened was they found out that we weren't the problem. And along with the same guy, he found out we weren't the problem. He just was given information and he said what was kind of supposed to be said. And there was reconciliation that happened. And I've had a few conversations with this guy, and mom and dad with their friends. They were able to kind of reconcile that. And even when the bad terms happen, when it's that terrible situation that happens, if you can kind of buck up and give it the best go that you can, leave as on best terms that you physically can, I think that it shows, like, one, it was a bad situation, but it wasn't all on one person, if that makes sense. Like that there's like that we're willing to reconcile through it, that we're willing to make things happen. Like there were maybe 4 people who knew that we were leaving the day that we left. And that's just, I mean, it is what it is. And a lot of people thought we left on good terms. And when they called us and asked, I said, no, it wasn't good terms. I've had probably 20 to 30 conversations with different families, and they're like, what happened? Because we have no idea. And there was actually my favorite, Donna. Donna is mama bear for me. And when she found out, she rose a big stunk out there, and she was like, she made a big stink about it, and she was like, this isn't right. You guys treated him poorly, and he helped carry this church through COVID, and he's 25. He's still a kid. Like, he was 25, 26 years old when he was doing this, and we had just got the new senior pastor February, right before COVID hit. So he hadn't even been there a month and a half, 2 months, and COVID hit. And I mean, nobody knew what they were doing. This was new territory for everybody. And so for us to take on almost all responsibility, I mean, I was doing 90% of that guy's work, plus the communication stuff, plus I was helping with the children's ministry. I was running the youth program. I was trying to work on some young adult programming. I was helping out with, I was actually on the district board, Christian education. So like for Springfield camp meeting, like I was over there. There were so many things that I had on my plate, and I was trying to get ordained, and all that kind of started to fall apart. And I, like a year later, I'm like, it's okay. It's good. Like, and to have those conversations coming back, like I could go and hug this guy, like, and not have that problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but it just when you said that, it made me think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, those are all good things. Like I try not to get like super sappy and emotional about it, but like it's a hard thing. Like it's, transitions in ministry are hard. Like, but there is hope in that. And like, something that I was taught early on was that, like, okay, maybe this isn't working out right now, meaning that the church that you're currently serving and you're transitioning out, but there are other people that need you. Jesus needs you to be that advocate for other people, and that's okay. So, back to the relationships thing, like during 2020, we have 2, I think, of the greatest people in the world. Their names are Gus and Deanna. They have a cleaning business. They paint. Gus is one of the most amazing painters. Like if you ever need your home painted or things like that, or he paints commercial businesses. Like, they've started a business from the ground up. So when we were going through this season, they knew that we were going through this season. And then, like, you slap COVID on top of that. Like, what are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? But like, to this day, we've pretty much had dinner with them every single week, like for the last 3 years. They walked us through that season. They were going through that season. There was a lot of transitions in that ministry at that time. So yeah, it's good to have those people in your corner to help you, to walk with you, to cry with you, to hug you, to do that thing. And to Jordan's point, like Mitchell Birch once said this in a sermon, but he said forgiveness is one of the most guttiest things that you can do. Mm-hmm. And people, I'll say it again, forgiveness is one of the most guttiest things that you can do. Meaning that, like, people can be mad, but if you forgive them, then that's on them. And to what Jordan was saying, like, he's like, I forgive you. It's fine. It's all good. I've walked through that. I've worked through it. And guess what? It's the ball's in your court now. If you want to be free of that, right, then you're going to be good, right? Like, what does Scripture say? Like, you repent, you believe, let it go, basically, right? Not to quote a Frozen song, but like, just to let it go, right?
How do you know I've been watching a lot of Frozen with Ollie lately?
Yeah, you posted that picture the other day, and Ollie was face planted on the bed. He must have really enjoyed Frozen. He was done. Kind of as we like wrap up our time together, I kind of want to talk about staying longer in a position than you should in ministry. Like, and twofold, right? Like, what I mean by that is, have you stayed longer in a position than you should as either a lead pastor or an associate pastor? Because, like, we're kind of like a good hybrid, the three of us, because we've been in multiple churches and multiple positions, lead pastor, associate pastors, youth pastors, worship pastors. That, we've been talking about transitions in ministry and the heartache of ministry, but like, twofold, right? One, us transitioning, have we stayed too long in a position of ministry than we should? Should we, have we bowed out gracefully like we should, or have we stayed longer than we should, right? The other side of that is, have you stayed or been a part of a ministry where another staff member should leave, or you think that they should leave as far as, being released themselves, right? Like, and I'm probably going to like rub some people the wrong way with this, but like it's a conversation that needs to be had, right? There was one church I served at, the pastor had been there 27 years. 27 years, right? And like, it was just like, that's great. That's a huge milestone to celebrate. However, you get to kind of be into the rote of things, right? You get rote, meaning you just go through the motions. You come in, you preach your sermon, you sometimes hold office hours, sometimes you don't. You become really lax in your profession, right? You just go through the motions of ministry, and like sometimes that stuff passes you by. And I was listening to another podcast this morning, but like, guys, the three of us are at very unique ages where like our parents are kind of coming towards the middle to the end of their time in ministry, or they're going to retire, or they're going to do those things. Or like, we're like, Scott, you and I are in our 30s, Jordan, you're in your mid to late 20s. But like, what does that look like? Have you guys been a part of that? Like, I don't think that I've stayed in a ministry position longer than I should have. I've, in most cases, have just bowed out gracefully and walked away because I feel like the Lord was releasing me from that. But I've also been in situations where pastors, I believe that pastors have stayed longer than they should have, and they're not really seeking out wisdom as to transitioning to another role or retiring, and it's not my call, right? It's not my place to tell people to do that, but it just feels that way. Have you guys been through that?
Yeah, I would say that for me personally, I think every position that I have resigned from, there had to be at least a wrestling match. There's always a wrestling match for me where it was more of a, how do I, you kind of feel that call to move away, but yet sometimes it's never really towards like when things are like really bad. It's usually towards when things are kind of good, or maybe things may have gotten stagnant. And I mean, when I left camp ministry, I mean, I wrestled with that for probably about a year. I wrestled with it.
That's a great word, Scott. The word stagnant, that's a great word. And I think like, I want to push back a little bit. Like,
yeah, go ahead.
The COVID, right? I hate that word. If I never heard that word again, I would be ecstatic, right? But like, I think COVID pushed churches and pushed leaders and pushed pastors in a direction in a positive way, because there were things that they had never done before. They had to reinvent the wheel. They had to rethink how they were going to do ministry, whether it was going to be online or in person. Could we have people in person? Could we have an online service? Do we have the technology? Do we have the resources? Do we have the things? And like, I think it pushed people in a way that, they got outside of their comfort zone, right? And so things that were stagnant, all of a sudden, what now? Right? Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
I just thought about that.
No. So, I wrestled with it, and then I made a decision, and it was the right decision. Same thing when I was ready to leave Ohio. I wrestled with it, but we also knew it was a good decision. That I didn't wrestle with it too much, not because I was like, I'm ready to leave, but it was more of, I felt more to do more full-time ministry, because I know sometimes, when you're working 2 other jobs and then you do a ministry job, so 3 jobs in total, sometimes there's things there are things where I could have did better if I was at full time and really hit my strengths and my stride, instead of kind of doing it halfway in some ways. Not that I was forcing it, but I couldn't go do everything that I really needed to do. Plus we had our first son, and it was like, and my wife didn't want to have to keep driving an hour and a half to work all the time, because that was the only place you could find a job, because there's nothing in the Youngstown area for doing legal positions. So she had to go to Cleveland. And then Virginia was weird, because I felt kind of that push to leave in 2019. And I would say 2019, even though if you look at kind of more of the structure of things weren't great, but as far as ministry and how the Spirit was moving, it was like a rocket ship. It was it was going up, but I kind of felt that there was a time that I needed to leave, and it was like, okay. So I'm like looking out there, and then when, you know, the word that you hate, Micah, hit, COVID, I kind of felt almost like this calling that I needed to stay and try to get the church through a pandemic. Because of my skill with video production, my skill with that, I was going to try to do those things to kind of help fix things. And then God was providing. And I mean, I already took a pay cut at the beginning of 2020. And there was some other stuff that happened that was not great. And then the pandemic hit like immediately right after all that stuff happened. And it was like, I just felt God say, stay and try to help them. And I did. And eventually it got to the point where it's like, yeah, I need to go. And it wasn't necessarily don't look for positions, still apply for stuff, still look for positions, but, you know, try to stay a little bit longer to try to get everything going and get them out through this pandemic. So once things started to open up more, and I mean, we've had our highs, our peaks, and our valleys with COVID, but I think I got to a point where I was at peace thinking, you know, if I left, it'd be okay. Like things would be fine. And I don't have to worry about, you know, everything collapsing because I left, or everything collapsing because, you know, because certain team members that are on the team are still kind of making poor decisions on behalf of the church. So I felt like it was at a good season where I could just simply say, okay, the pieces are in place, everything's good, I can now bow out.
Yeah. Jordan, what about you?
You know, I've seen a few pastors that have stayed longer than I think that they should have. My home church that I grew up in, I think that there were there were some transitions. I think that like there was this guy, Pastor Reynolds. I think he did phenomenal. I think he was there like 22 years, and like he did phenomenal. I wish he would have stayed longer. I think that he just was, it was great, but he was ready to go. And correct me if I'm wrong, didn't your dad actually also serve with Pastor Reynolds?
My dad was an associate twice for Jerry Reynolds at Eaton Church, which is kind of the weird connection that we have. But yeah, my dad was at Eaton twice. He was associate pastor under Pastor Reynolds at their old building, and then he took a pastorate in Mississippi when I was born. He was the lead pastor in Mississippi for 6 years, and then he came back to Ohio, and then he was Jerry Reynolds' associate again.
Yeah. So Jerry Reynolds, phenomenal guy. I think the world of Jerry. And then there were two guys that followed him with an interim in between, and I think that the first guy that followed, it just kind of is what it is. I don't like the way that things happened, but you know, it is what it is. The second guy, he was there for quite some time, and I remember there were just some issues that kind of were not spoken. There were some people who were like, I'm not real happy with the way things played out, with some issues, and I think that he stayed a little longer than he should have. Not saying that it was terrible, but I think that he could have kind of left it like a year or two earlier and been like, hey, it's fine, we're good, because he was there. He got there when I was, I think, a freshman. I think he just left a couple of years ago. So he was there almost 10 years. And so I think that that's kind of where I sit with that. But like for me personally, I think that I stayed a little long. I think I stayed longer than I should have by a couple months. It wasn't like years or anything like that, but I think even a couple months, I felt God starting to tug at my heart in December, that, hey, I need to start looking. And we kind of played it off, and we were just like, you know, we'll kind of wait and see a little bit longer. And then February, all that stuff happened. But I think that there can be a lot of damage done if you stay too long and you start to not hurt or if you're there hurting the church and not helping, when it's more about you and less about the church and the needs of the church and the needs of the people and the community around you. And
it becomes about a paycheck and your salary.
Yeah, it becomes that
Yeah.
career, like what we were talking about earlier.
It's the whole other conversation.
And
Yeah.
and I'll piggyback on that about, you know, longevity, because, you know, when we look at, because I mean, like Micah, you talked about how you've been at churches, like the most you've been at a church has been 4 years. Most I've been at a church has been 6 years. And Jordan, the most you've been at a church has been like 3 years.
3.5.
3.5. And it's weird because when you look at because anytime when I look at like church leadership or culture things, it's always like, you know, it takes about 7 years for a congregation to completely trust the pastor. And this is looking at just lead pastor stuff. And then about 13 years is when you see kind of a transition in a pastor, where a pastor begins to transition, whether it's transition to a new ministry or transition to a new role, or even just transition, have a spiritual transformation where they're gaining more wisdom to be able to have the spiritual strength to continue on doing the same position they're doing. I mean, I have a buddy of mine who's been at the same church for coming close to 30 years. And this guy went from being an associate in the church to being a youth pastor in a church to being now the executive pastor of a church. And in each of those different various seasons in those last 30 years, he still continues to kill it, still continues to do great work, still continues to move on. And it's been great. And I mean, he's worked with some great pastors. He's worked at pastors who've stayed and left at the appropriate time, some pastors who've probably stayed on longer than they should, and some pastors who probably left, you know, way before they should have. Like they probably should have stayed a little bit more, and they just kind of left early just because of poaching or whatever you want to call her, or there's been some circumstances where they had to leave early. Like I knew of a church that their pastor's there for 2 years and they left early because both their parents got really sick and he had to go back to Kansas to go take care of his family. So he had to leave he was there for 2 years and had to go back because no one else was he was the only child. So who was going to look after his parents? So he had to step away. So it's like kind of a early departure than what he could have done because of circumstances beyond his control. Hey, Micah, you're muted.
I don't know why I muted that. I think I'm getting like a package from Amazon and I keep feeling like the doorbell's going to ring. So like, I keep thinking I hear the doorbell, but
okay.
That's why I keep muting my mic. So, you know, guys, we've talked a lot about the Heartbreak of Ministry. But the last question I kind of want to leave our listeners with is, has it brought you healing? Right. And that's a broad question, but like, has it brought you healing? Like have transitions of ministry, you know, brought you healing in a good way? Have it brought you, you know, has it brought you healing? Like, and has that healing allowed you to move forward in your next assignment, your next calling? Or are you still walking through that? It can be both. Scott, what do you think?
So, I mean, when I left in June of last year, I planned to go to a retreat for healing that dealt with pastor woundedness and everything else. So I made sure I was there. It's the same organization where I learned how to do formational prayer. And I know I sent my information to Jordan to kind of help him out with some stuff. So it's the same group of people, the same stuff. So, I mean, I've learned on how to do it with people, but I myself have never been through the process of the one being getting the help and getting the healing and go walking through that process. So it was great to kind of go anyway, whether it was ministry related or not, just to see, okay, how does this look like in a actual situation, like if I want to do a retreat. With that being said, I went there and it really helped me open up to a lot of things, some things that I was unaware of about myself and how I handle stressful situations, how I deal with negative self-talk, even just kind of the idea. And I think this is kind of mainly key, and this is a big thing I've been learning from healing, is identity. Because, and I was even sharing this with my wife the other day, yesterday, actually, when I got back from convention, I said, you know, working in ministry for as long as I have, a lot of my identity was built on how much of a hard worker I was. I do great work. I work hard. When I preach the word of God, it's not something where they hear it and then it's gone, you know, it goes in one ear on Sunday morning and then by Monday it's gone. Like, it's something when I preach a word of God and the way I present the word to the congregation, it's something that they think about all week. So, there's certain things like when you think about hard work, the way I study the scriptures and present that to people, the way I do Bible study, and the way I am creative, and the way I really push out into the community and really try to make community connections. There's a lot of these things that shape my identity. So then when you hear that for so long, and then you go to a place where now they're saying this isn't good enough, or you hear like, oh, well, you're being lazy, or you hear these nasty comments about these things that you have prided yourself on, it really begins to take a toll on you. And you really begin to think about, well, am I even, is this, and you begin to say, well, is this true? Like, am I lazy? Am I not a hard worker? Am I not doing enough in the community? Am I not doing this? And it wasn't until I went to this thing, it says, well, why is that so important to your identity? Because if our identity is rooted in Jesus Christ, then when somebody says, oh, you're great at this, or you're not so great at the same thing, that doesn't matter, because I'm doing what God's calling me to do. I'm doing what I believe God is challenging me to push. And even decisions that I make, if I'm bathing it in prayer and I'm saying, Lord, how do I proceed in this situation? What's the best course of action? And I'm praying about it. And I say, I believe from what I read in the scriptures and just from my alone time with God, that this is the best course of action. And if someone wants to crap all over it, at the end of the day, that's not has nothing to do with my character, because my identity is rooted in Christ. And when my identity is rooted in Christ, and that becomes the thing, then, the cheers and jeers of public opinion is not going to push me off the straight and narrow road. And I think one of the blind spots for me in my ministry is that had been a huge issue with me, especially when I came in Virginia, and I felt like I had to please people, and I had to prove that I was a good pastor. And I mean, even me saying it now, I'm like, dude, I sound so stupid saying it, but I mean, it was so much of my identity. And I felt like, from the healing standpoint, I am healed from that. And not only am I healed from that, but now it's to that point where even if I'm in this moment of transition in my life, I can go and I can apply to places, and I can objectively look at stuff and say, okay, whether I go to a healthy church, or if I go back to a church that's kind of semi-healthy, semi-unhealthy, or if I go to a church that I can tell, man, this place is an absolute disaster, and I really don't want to be here. But at the same time, if God is saying, hey, I'm going to use you with your skills and your talents, and I'm going to equip you to go to this place that may not be luxurious, because I know that you can do a lot of spiritual healing in this place. And it may be, you could be here for 30 years. You may be here for 2 years, but you're really going to start ripping out Band-Aids, and you're really going to allow my Holy Spirit to heal some of the deep-rooted, festering wounds in this place. That's what I'm going to call you to do. And I think this goes back to, if I see this as a career, then yeah, I'm not going to that place. But if I see that as a calling, and that's where I feel God is pulling on my heartstrings and leading me, and I'm having that wrestling match with God again. I love using that word, wrestling match. I feel like that's kind of what it is. It's like, ooh, God, I know you're calling me to go here, but man, I don't want to do this again. If that's what God calls me, and he promises that he's going to be there for me, his Spirit's going to be there to guide me. He's going to use his Spirit through me to really bring healing and reconciliation to some cultural things within the church, and to maybe some relational things in the church that I'll serve next, then, that's what I'm called to do. And if he wants to call me to become a Joel Osteen or Steve Furtick and have like a super large church, or Steve Childs and have a super large church and be there for 30 plus years, then, that'd be great. I would love that. If he's calling me to transition out of doing church ministry and calling me to do more educational ministry and being a professor somewhere, then I'll do that. If he's calling me to be the new head of the Church of God and take Jim Lyon's place, then I'll do that. I saw Micah, I saw your look. Not that I want that,
No, I
But
mean, that's
if
a
God,
big ask. That's what I'm
that's a
saying.
big ask. But again, I'm not asking for it. And that's the
Yeah.
thing. I'm not asking for that. I don't want that. But if God says, this is what I want you to do, and I feel that pressure to go that route, then I will go that route. And I think that's where I kind of got for most of my healing. My identity in Christ is probably the most important thing that's going to push me forward. And because of my identity in Christ, that's the thing that I have to take care of. And if I'm too busy neglecting that truth to please people, if I'm neglecting that truth to try to be at every single meeting or to have my hand in every single outreach or growth group or everything else, then I'm just going to get burned out. I'm just going to get bitter and angry and distraught and tired. I mean, but if my identity is in Christ, then that's what's going to recharge me. That's what's going to keep my eyesight, my spiritual eyesight in clear focus and not get blurred.
Yeah. Jordan, what do you think about, it's probably a big question for you, because I know you just kind of transitioned from one to the other ministry wise. Like, have you felt healing? Has there been healing in your life and in your calling and your ministry?
Yeah. I started thinking about this question because I read it. I started to cry a little bit because I've looked back at the past year, and the church in Ohio, that was home. We lived right down the road, and there was a lot of heartbreak, and we decided not to talk to people. The majority, we actually defriended people because of the contract that we signed as we left, that we wouldn't defame the church, we wouldn't and they wouldn't defame us. Unfortunately they did, and they broke contract and things like that, and that was really hard. But we decided to take the higher road through that, and through some of the conversations I've had, I went through counseling, which I'm just going to speak this real quick. If you've not had counseling and you're listening to this, don't feel like you're too man or too woman or like too macho for that. Like, counseling is a beautiful, beautiful healing tool. I was able to go through a lot of like unpacking some of that, and I questioned a lot of things. And my counselor, like, she went in and just was like, Jordan, it's okay to ask these questions. It's okay to work through this. It's okay. Like, she helped me. And there were a few sessions where I just sat there and just cried almost the entire session. And there was just a lot of healing that happened. And so if you're like, counseling's not really my thing. No. Don't play it off, because if you haven't had it, like, there's a lot that can be done in a short amount of time. Even Scott has done some counseling with me, just like helping me find this piece called meeting the Lord in a safe place, that he's designed this process, and he's kind of borrowed, tweaked, and still some stuff, and really helped me. And I actually practice that quite a bit. Just trying to do some just meditation with it. And I feel like this past year, it went from, I want to sue this church. I want to destroy them for what they did to me. Because I mean, the nonsense that they pulled, like, why would you ever want to do that to anybody in the church? Like, I just sat back and it hurt so bad in that time. And a year later, I'm not mad at them. Now, the senior pastor who I'm related to, I'm not mad, especially with him going and telling my when they asked him, hey, like, would you hire Jordan Halston? He said no. Like, do not hire this guy. Like, I'm not mad at that. I'm more just frustrated and saddened that 10 years of relationship is gone. That 3.5 years of relationship with this church is gone. And there are some people who just won't talk with me because they believe some of the lies that were said, and that hurts. But like, being here, there's this mentality here in Oklahoma that they've given me, and they said, do you feel valued? Do you feel that we as a church value you? Do you feel that you're worth? Like, do you feel your worth here? Because that's what we want. We want to make sure that you're taken care of. If you need the extra time off, dude, take it. Like,
and I don't want to interrupt real quick, but I think when we went back to performance reviews, I think that if you're going to do a performance review, just that question, do you feel valued by us? And I think from that initial conversation, that could bring up not only a whole bit of healing, but also if you're saying no, then it's like, okay, what are we as a church doing wrong that you do not feel valued? And then
and how
make
can
those
we
changes.
make those changes to help?
Mhm.
Because pastoral care is vastly important. Like there are people, I remember having a conversation in Ohio where I said, I just don't want ever to burn out. Like I don't want that. And someone said, well, Jordan's burning out. He's not even been here a year. And I laid at my heart on the table with these people. I said, I'd like that in 5 years that I can still keep going strong, that I'm not burned out by stuff. And so just with some of that, that's kind of where we're at. And so it was really cool to see some of that and to see that, this is where we're going. Because here they value us. They go in and say, hey, how are you doing? How are you feeling? There was a time where I was in a staff meeting and at the end, my senior pastor comes up to me and says, hey, I noticed something's off. Are you okay? And to have that, it helped me heal through some things and to know that like, it's not fake out here. And at the church, I'm very blessed, and I feel like I've been healing and I've been able to get through some really cool stuff. So yeah, I feel like I've been able to heal through it. So yeah.
Yeah. And, kind of as we, wind down and wrap our time up, I think that Jordan, you said a really key phrase that people don't want to acknowledge, but burnout, right? I didn't realize how burnout I was on ministry and being a pastor. And for somebody who's so young, like I'm not a spring chicken. I'm 34 years old, but like, the last two ministry places I was at, I was starting to build a lot of resentment because of how burned out because I was just going and going and going, and I was trying to impress people, and I was trying to make sure people could see what I could do and bring to the table. And, I finally kind of had that come to Jesus meeting with the Lord and with, my wife. And I was like, it's just not worth my marriage. It's not worth my life.
Yeah.
It's not worth my blood pressure. It's not worth, just going through the motions and like starting to neglect the church all over again. And I'm just like, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it. So like that season, when I said it's probably one of the most fruitful seasons of my ministry, I wasn't technically like a pastor on staff at a church anywhere. Like I was week to week, I was leading worship at different places, and I served as an interim here, and I, consulted with this church, and I coached that church. And it was just like, there is something to be said about not being tethered to the local church. And I said that with you guys. I said that with other pastor friends of mine. And like, there's something so fulfilling to go help churches that need it. And I've had a lot of healing in the last 2 years. I'm not completely healed, but I know that God's working through that. And so, I guess that's the heartache of ministry. I mean, we could go so many different directions with it, but Scott, as the co-host, I want to turn it back over to the host, because I don't know if you have any other any other words or any other.
Yeah, I would say this. I think there's a couple of important things, especially for our listeners who are listening to this, who may kind of be in this transitional page. Maybe there's a couple things like Jordan. I love your man. I want to sue them, because I think what happens in ministry is when we get through some of those tumultuous times, we're not honest with our feelings, and we're not honest with our emotions. And I think especially, and I don't necessarily know about like women in ministry. I can't speak to that, but I know for men in ministry, I grew up in a culture where, I never seen men become emotional. Or if I do see men become emotional, it's just anger and anger and anger. And I think a lot of times, and I was even telling my wife about this, that sometimes, even though she's like, I want you to be honest and true with your feelings, for me, it always comes out as anger, and not because I'm angry about stuff, but because there's just so much stuff that I've gotten pushed down. Like even sadness, melancholiness, like it all comes out as anger because it's been compressed to anger, because I can't show it. And I think a lot of times when, so when it comes to the healing process, sometimes if you have to start at a place of like being cathartic and you just need to write, or you need to go to someone who you 100% trust, and preferably someone outside the church, or inside the church environment that you're in, and just be like, man, those dirty, rotten scoundrels, I'm gonna stick it to the man, and whatever. And you have to get that stuff out in order for you to kind of get to that place of going, okay. Because again, like, I think in the thick of it, I had to get to that point where I had to be like, oh, those dirty dogs. But then after a while, it's like, I'm able to see the other side of it, and I can heal from that.
I would encourage, though, that make sure that person is also aware that they need to keep that quiet, because you can work through your feelings. I remember having this conversation, like, our tithing was shared, and I was mad, and like, for me, just to share and say, I'm frustrated, like, I can't believe this was shared. And it took me a week, and that following Monday, they came in and were really, really like, oh, we heard you wanted to rip us a new one. And I was like, where'd you hear that from? Because only 2 people knew, and it was the senior pastor and a board member. And it was the board member who shared, hey, your tithing was shared. And I went to the senior pastor. I said, am I wrong for being mad? And that week, I kept to myself. I was very, very frustrated. But I would encourage, like, if you need that, which I think we all need it, we need that sounding board, not to make that a public person that can't keep their mouth shut. They need to know the value of the secrecy there.
Yeah, confidentiality is key.
Yes.
And then I think, just finding wise counsel. Like, you can talk to a trusted person, but there's difference between me venting to somebody and feeling better about it, and me going to a counselor who's trying to draw stuff out to help me unpack it. And it's someone with that counseling skill. Like, I mean, even Jordan, I say counselor, but you talk to me and I have a counseling skill, and I can, try to give you some tools and give you some methods to try. And, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. That's okay. So I think for those of you who are listening, who have been hurt by the church, whether you're a leader, and we didn't really hit the other side of this as far as, like, just your average parishioner who may have been hurt by a church, by someone in abuse of power or whatever. I think that's a whole different side to the same thing of church hurt. But I think with that being said, that I think by seeking wise counsel and going healing, and then again, spend time with the Lord and be honest. Like, I go back to the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah was so brutally honest with God about how he was feeling. And I mean, there's some verses in there that I think if you were to really highlight them and really focus it on our modern language today, I think people would start blushing on how brutally honest and some of the kind of accusations he's making towards God, which are not very flattering of God's character. And I think, God's big enough to handle our complaints. He's big enough to handle our cathartic process. And I think when we can go to him and really just pour out into him, he always gives us his healing. He gives us his grace. He gives us his mercy. And he always gives us the wisdom and insight, and is able to reveal things to us and kind of help put things back into perspective. And I think that's a key point as well. So that's kind of my concluding thoughts. Anyone else had anything that you want to add to that? Or
no, I think all right. I think we did it justice.
All right. Well, justice has been served on this podcast. Guys, thank you so much for listening to us. And again, big thanks to Micah and Jordan for joining me on this episode. I greatly appreciate it. And again, guys, if you like this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. Give us a 5-star review. That helps people find like-minded podcasts on religion, entertainment, and even psychology. I think these are some great topics that I'm interested in. Also, if you'd like to specifically support this podcast, you can go to my Coffee account. That is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. You could donate one time. You can be a monthly subscriber. And by doing that, that really helps. And all the proceeds go to the improvement of this podcast and being able to have, multiple people talking, like right now, like with Micah, Jordan, and I, instead of just me and Micah, or me and Phil, or just me talking to myself. And hopefully you guys are listening to me. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys have a great week, and we'll be out with a new podcast next week. Talk to you guys later. Bye.